Good morning, and you may be seated. So, Father Tom introduced me as being from Texas, and that is the most recent place that I have come from. But for the first 21 years of my life, I grew up in rural Virginia, and my mother's side of the family has come from that part of the state for a very, very long set of generations. And so if you picture the coal mines and timber mills of the Appalachian Mountains, the rich farmlands of the Shenandoah Valley, and John Denver singing all the way, "Country roads, take me home," you have a pretty good picture of what it was like growing up in the 1980s, as I did in Augusta County, Virginia. Now, growing up, I didn't really understand the, we'll say, scandal of my mother's side of the family until I was much older. All I knew is that my maternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather didn't get along. All I knew is they hadn't spoken a word to one another in over 30 years. And when my mother made the decision after I was born to regain contact with what would be my maternal grandmother, her mother, whom I affectionately called Nanny, that was reason enough for my grandfather to not speak to us for well over 30 years. And to give you somewhat of an indication of the kind of person Nanny was, let's just say my favorite memory from early childhood was she picked me up from preschool one evening. She put me in the passenger seat and then slid across the hood of the car, Dukes of Hazzard style, put on her shades, lit up a cigarette, and then from the driver's seat said to me, "Buckle up, Buttercup, we're going for a ride." It was only in my teenage years when I realized Nanny had a rather wild, young adulthood. I'll spare you the gory details, but let's just say that you had to do some pretty outlandish things in the mid-1950s for the state to take away your two children and leave them in the custody of the recently divorced and single father, my grandfather. In an age where women were almost always able to retain custody of their children, my grandmother was a notable outlier. And then I get to college and I start doing things like studying the Bible for a living, and I instantly become drawn to passages like our Old Testament reading from Hosea. The prophet offers an example of a lived experience of just about everybody's pain in my family's equation. He offers a lived experience of my grandfather's pain of experiencing marital infidelity when he was but just a young newlywed with two young children. He offers the lived experience of the prophet's wife, Gomer, who seems like, at least to me, a reasonable approximation of my nanny's younger days. And the narrative of the three children that are produced from this union seem to really encapsulate my family story. How indeed do children respond when their world is shattered by divorce? So yes, we are going to talk about the Hosea passage today. And to quote my late nanny, "Buckle up, buttercups, we're going for a ride." So I have to begin by addressing the elephant in the room. This passage is jarring to read. It can often be difficult to comprehend without adequate historical context, and the subject matter is, to be polite, lurid, to say the least. The opening lines of Hosea's text create a sense of religious shock and awe that aims to leave the reader off balance. It may be tempting to say, well, this passage really hasn't aged all that well, but the truth of the matter is, for its original audience in approximately 740 BC, it was an offensive story. And it retains its offensiveness even today. Now, Hosea's narrative begins with God commanding the prophet to marry, let's say, a woman of questionable fidelity and commitment to the institution of marriage. And the reason for this command is equally shocking, because the people have forsaken the Lord their God. As a side note, a student of mine a few years back asked me to summarize, hey, Professor Corey, can you tell me what the Old Testament is about in just a few seconds? And my answer was this: the Old Testament is a narrative of God establishing a covenant with Abraham's descendants for the first 5 books, and then for the next 34 books and 1,400 years, he is then trying to salvage that relationship. And the reason for God's broken relationship with his people typically falls into one of 3 categories. 1, they have been needlessly and unapologetically violent, i.e., they do not love their neighbors as themselves. They perpetuate systems of inequality that harm the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the sojourner, i.e., they do not love their neighbors as themselves. And they compromise their worship by worshiping God either in forbidden ways or worshiping forbidden gods. The other commandment is being broken here. They do not love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their soul, and all their strength. And Hosea confronts all 3 of these categorical sins throughout his book, and he uses the very spicy term to describe these inadequacies in today's passage as whoredom. Now, at this juncture, you may be tempted to say for yourself, oh, good, I'm glad that's not me. It's those other people who have compromised their faith. It's those other people who harm their fellow human beings. It's certainly not me, right? Unfortunately, such rhetoric really reminds me of 2 events from Jesus' ministry. One is where it is on his last night, and he says, one of you will betray me, and of the 12 people, only 1 is about to betray him, but all of them are asking the right question. Is it me? They turn it inward upon themselves. The other is that Jesus gives a parable in Luke chapter 18, where a Pharisee and a tax collector go up to pray. And the Pharisee uses this opportunity in his prayer to thank God that, oh, I'm glad I'm not like these other people. I do all of these things right, and I'm definitely not like this tax collector here. The tax collector simply says, God, be merciful to me, I am a sinner. And this is why in the Episcopal tradition, we still regularly confess our sins as part of the liturgy. We acknowledge that by the things we have done and the things we have left undone, we may have been the bad guy in God's narrative, and we are in need of restoration, reform, and redemption. As you said earlier, we are in need of being a saved sinner and return the flock. The religious shock and awe of Hosea's narrative puts the reader off balance for this very reason. It becomes a chance for introspection. It becomes a chance to ask, where have I sinned? Where have I fallen short? Where have I been less than faithful to my commitments to the Lord? And while, yes, the language is harsh, I ask you, don't look away. The ultimate message of Hosea is not that God is out to destroy such people of boredom. The message is that God can and God will make something out of sinful people if they would only repent and come to him. Now, as a historian of the Old Testament, one of the big questions that folks like to ask of this text is Hosea's story historical or is it a parable? Did God audibly tell this man, pick a woman with a bad reputation and marry her? Or is this more of a vision that Hosea is having, with the point of that exercise being empathy with how God must feel about having his covenant broken again and again by his people? And sadly, the answer to this is similar to a line from another commercial from the 80s that I dearly loved. Just how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? A world? You never know. Hosea is only the first of a long line of prophets who will use this visceral image of marital unfaithfulness as a metaphor for God's anguish at his people's unfaithfulness. So, regardless, is Hosea historical or a metaphor? The message reveals something very surprising about our God. God can be hurt. God can be disappointed. And God can even mourn the loss of connection with his people. Such a metaphor reminds me of Michelangelo's painting on the Sistine Chapel of creation. It's the fairly famous painting where God and Adam are doing this. And in this painting, it is God who has his finger fully extended, fully reaching to mankind. Adam's finger is only partially extended, needing that last little bit of motion to fully connect back with his maker. Hosea's portrait of God is very much like Michelangelo's in that God is pictured as being surprisingly vulnerable. This is not the portrait of God judging sins with methodological clarity, using pass-fail rubrics. This is a portrait of a God who is deeply invested in his people. And it's the kind of investment that involves risk. It's the kind of investment that involves loss, maybe even not ever returning a profit. It's the kind of investment that just might end in heartbreak. And when you think about God in this way, it really gives other well-known passages like John 3:16 quite a punch. If God does feel this deeply, if God does love this riskily, then it is something indeed for God to love this world so much to give his only begotten Son. It is a God who is not afraid to love and deeply commit, even when his people sin. God sends his Son, born of a woman, to restore us at great personal cost. And I'll admit, as we think about this, the work of Jesus and the work of reconciliation in our own lives, that this is hard. For my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side, they never seemed to figure it out in this life, just how to coexist in the same world after their heartbreak. But Hosea paints a picture of God's fidelity with this narrative. God is looking for a way to take us back, even if we're the ones who choose to walk away. And that brings me to my first take-home point for you today, that God empathizes with our heartbreaks. God is not too transcendent or too impassive that he cannot relate to his people on an emotional level. So, if you find yourself like Hosea, heartbroken by disappointments, remember that God has felt that way too. And the good news is God does not allow heartbreak to have the final words. Let me say that again. God will not allow your heartbreak or his own to have the last laugh. Whether in this world or in the world to come without end, the God of reconciliation will somehow take those ashes of our losses and disappointments and make them beautiful and whole again. Or as Hosea puts it, in the place where it was once said to them, "You are not my people," it shall be said to them, "You are the children of the living God." iPhone. Sorry, that's the autism in me coming. Sorry. There's also 3 children that are described in this narrative. Those children are Jezreel, named after a rather bloody and decisive battle that basically kept the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel fighting a civil war for over 100 years. The other name, Lo Ramah, is literally not loved. And the name Lo Ami is literally not mine. To put this in a perspective, if this naming convention were to happen in today's day and age, Hosea would come up and he would probably introduce his children as, "This is 9/11. This one isn't mine. This one is hard to love." Don't worry about if they have any real names. That's who they are. And one of the things that I love about this Hosea passage is that God promises that these names, again, are not the final word. That these names, which sound so derogatory, do not get the final laugh. As God redeems his people, as God redeems Hosea and his situation, the names get changed. Where once you were Lo Ramah, not loved, you will be known as beloved. Where you were once known as Lo Ami, not mine, I shall name you my people. Or as Hosea puts it again, in the place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," it shall be said to them, "You are the children of the living God." But now let's shift gears and talk about the last character in this narrative, and arguably the most difficult person in the narrative to talk about, and that is Gomer, Hosea's wife. We don't learn much about her from this first chapter of Hosea, save that she is the daughter of a man named Diblaim, and that she is prone to, let's call it, marital indiscretions. It is only in the second chapter of Hosea that it's spelled out just a little bit more clearly. We discover that Gomer is what we would refer to today as a sex worker. Now, 10 years ago, when I was still in seminary, I would have very much parroted the teachings of my evangelical professors, and a passage like this would have really only had one purpose in the arsenal of evangelism, and that is that Christians need to do all they can in their power to end sex work and rescue such people as Hosea does for his wife in chapter 2. As I've grown spiritually, let me be frank, this sort of interpretation really comes from a person who hasn't met that many sex workers or ever truly listened to them. And as part of my own growing story, I will say my pivot for me on this issue came during COVID, when I finally started actually realizing I had personal connections with a sex worker. A student of mine, yes, a student at a Bible college, had to admit to me that they were working as a stripper in order to finance their way through college. And then COVID came and destroyed their main source of income, and they were left in a difficult lurch. How do I explain to my very conservative school that I've been paying my bills through a illicit manner? This was made doubly hard on them because they were already 3 years into a 4-year degree, and such a confession might mean the loss of literally 3 years of their scholarly work. Now, I don't know why they specifically asked me for help. I hope it's because in my teaching and in my personality, they were seeing the unconditional love and the ethics of Jesus being played out in real life. But they asked me for help during COVID. And me and my spouse, we gave them a place to live in our spare bedroom for about 1.5 years of the COVID pandemic. And I got to experience what it was like to actually listen to the voice of a person in that field. And one of the things that I had discovered is that this passage in Hosea had sadly been weaponized against such people. Many of them had lost friends in a church or even found themselves shunned by their home congregations when they learned that they had been involved in that industry. Another thing that I discovered is that many of the people who had been kicked out of their families as part of the LGBTQ community were frequently driven to acts of desperation where sex work seemed like it may be the only way out. And I realized from hearing their stories over and over again that this was also my grandmother's, my nanny's story. That even when we don't talk about it, even when we hide the truth, sometimes we must acknowledge that sex work and its roots run deep in our communities, and that it is very likely that someone that we love has at some time in their life been involved in such work. Now, as a single human being preaching this one-off sermon, I know this will at best be the start of a conversation. But as I read this text and I see my student and I see my grandmother and I see my friends in the LGBTQ community, and I reflect on this character named Gomer, I am forced to conclude that we need a much more robust dialogue with these folks above and beyond the simple platitude of go and sin no more. The redemption that Hosea is picturing is a holistic one. It is not simply a, you stopped sinning and now I can love you. It's much more like what Jesus shows people like Mary Magdalene or the woman at the well. It is restoration of their relationship with God. It is, as the prophet Hosea puts it, in the place where it was said, you are not my people, it shall be said of them, you are children of the living God. May we hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. Amen.